To kick off the first series, we have a very special guest, the Domme that trained me. Alex is a lifestyle dominatrix, and in the first of 3 incredible episodes, we dive deep to learn how Alex became a Domme. We discuss concepts like Mindgasm, transient meditative state, Subspace, Domme highs and lows, Aftercare, and so much more. Welcome to the life of Tash Mia again. So today I'm super excited to have a practicing Domme in her personal life and relationships. She's the Domme who trained me and is a very close dear friend of mine. Now Alex is not her real name, and you'll probably notice that you can't see her identity. This is not because she is not out in the open about being a practicing Domme. She's very open in her life about who she is. However, she does need to stay hidden due to some subs not knowing her true identity. So who better to bust some myths with about the BDSM world and take a bit of a deeper dive with me? So please welcome my very first guest, someone, as I said, I truly love, and I cannot wait for you all to meet her. Alex, thanks for being here and being my first guest.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So I just wanted to get a bit of a background so people could understand, like, where have you come from? What's a bit of your background?
Born and bred in Australia. Grew up in Queensland and have been in Sydney now for about 13 years.
And what kind of upbringing did you have? Because I know we're friends. I know you haven't had the most traditional upbringing, so I think you've got a really interesting bit of a story there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not what you would call a traditional upbringing at all. I grew up in a religious cult, which is definitely a different introduction to the world, and how you grow up and how you develop is what I would say somewhat tainted.
Yep. Now, I'm going to ask what most people will probably be thinking. Do you think growing up in that cult had any impact into you now being a dominatrix later in life?
I definitely want to make clear that any trauma of any kind, especially childhood trauma definitely needs to be properly addressed, and you definitely need therapy. So definitely seek professional help for those kinds of trauma or any trauma in your life. So I will say definitely no, because I have addressed my trauma in childhood very early on in my early 20s. I'm now over 40 and very proudly over 40, and feel like the decisions I have made sexually as an adult have nothing to do with childhood trauma. However, I will say that a lot of people that have childhood trauma and have addressed that and come out the other side tend to be very empathic people, very kind, and can read and understand human emotions.
Yeah.
And in order to do what I do in this lifestyle, you 100% need to be able to read emotions, understand human vulnerability, and be able to be show empathy towards that.
I think that's a really interesting point you bring up about empathy and being a dominatrix. I think, you know, the traditional view of cold, hard, mean bitch Dom, which I've talked about in the past, is what people view. Like, but empathy and reading people is a very important part of being a Dom. What do you think else is like made you a better Dom? What characteristics do you think in you, or that you kind of learnt growing up, or that you've experienced?
I would say it's definitely not from what I've learnt growing up.
Yeah.
However, throughout my adulthood, definitely going through different relationships have taught me about different personalities and being choosing this sexually as my sexual preference in life. Being able to read and understand people, not just by expressions, because sometimes, as you can't see my face today, you won't be able to see their expressions. So being able to read human body language and things like that is really, really important.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you, because obviously we've mentioned and people can see you're wearing a master day if they're watching this on video. Family and friends, is this something that they know about you?
Absolutely. My closest family and friends that I am in contact with, and I make that very clear. People who know me now 100% understand what my preferences are, and I'm very proud about my lifestyle choices. But in regards to, obviously, I'm employed outside of this. This is not what I do as a professional. This is what I do in my personal life. So professionally, I like to keep that very separate from what I do in my personal life. It has no correlation.
Would it bother you if someone, like a colleague at work, found out that you were a dom in your personal life?
Absolutely not. I would be interested as to how they found out. But I would love the opportunity to have the conversation. So for me, I'm definitely very proud about who I am and why I've come to this. So having the opportunity to open up and explain that to people,
Yeah.
I thrive on that. It's
Yeah.
definitely something I think people need to hear more about.
Yeah. Have you ever told someone and it's been taken in a negative way?
No, I've been extremely lucky in the fact that everybody is all the people that I love and surround myself with are very open and open-minded people who are very accepting of lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
So I have not had a bad reaction. However, I still get reactions from men actually in the scene
Yeah.
who don't understand that a woman can be dominant naturally.
Yeah. And what generally are the kind of things that they're coming up to you and saying when that happens?
Don't know if this is appropriate, but one of the biggest misconceptions which make me extremely mad is that men often believe that you have not had a good enough man in your life.
She's just waiting for the right D to come along.
Exactly, which is just a absolute joke and total misuse of why I make these choices.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fair enough. So leading up to you becoming a dom, what kind of first got you into it? What was like, was there a particular point in your life you're like, hey, this is what I want to do? Was it something that was introduced to you? What kind of like kicked it off?
I was definitely always dominant in the bedroom.
Yeah.
Never knew or explored how dominant that could be until later in life. And I was introduced this basically through my own sexual exploration and found somebody who was a male sub who was willing to talk to me about exploring this.
Yeah.
And that led to a lot of bing, bing, bing moments. And I just wanted to know more from there. So, but I feel like I've always been, and that's actually what led him to me and attracted him to me, was the fact that I was dominant in the bedroom to start with.
Yeah.
And then exploring what options BDSM offer, because there are so many different options, exploring that and working out what I did like and what I did not like, and having somebody to explore that with was very important to my process.
Yeah. And so you've met someone, you obviously had this in you and you're now exploring it. How did you learn about it?
Lots of different ways. So there was no one way.
Yeah.
A lot to do with online research, which there is so much available at the click of a finger these days. So definitely learn that. I met a lot of people in the scene. I went to professional Dominatrix to learn about different things that I wanted to explore that I hadn't yet, and heaps of practice, especially on myself, in relation to pain and things like that to explore before I would ever try it on someone else.
Yeah. And would you say you kind of came up and discovered what your preferred kinks were that way, or do you think it was more through exploring with like other partners?
Definitely through exploring. I was very, very lucky to have somewhat of a sub who was very willing to try almost everything.
Yep.
Had a very high pain tolerance.
Yeah, very rare, very rare.
And 100% masochist he was. And so for me, it was left up to my imagination and basically my training and my own development in order to be able to practice those things.
Yeah. And when we come to like the real world, now I know you're a personal Dom, so unlike me who's a professional Dom, I have, Mistress Tash Mia. Outside of work, I'm me. Like there's two different characters. With you, obviously there's not so much that delineation. So in your normal day life, do you think you come across as a Dom? Do you bring that Dom out at work, or is it something that really is in the bedroom for you?
I'd definitely say that anybody who knows me would not say that that was too much far of a stretch to imagine me as a Dom, because my personality type is very naturally dominant in all of my aspects of life.
Yeah. Give us an example, if you can, in life where you think people might notice you're a bit more Dom than someone who's going to be a bit more like vanilla, let's use the term.
I 100% believe in strong women leadership.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm very vocal about that. And I'm very expressive when it comes to, I don't hold back about my opinions on things, because for me, everybody in a room deserves their time to talk.
Their voice.
So I will express my voice very willingly.
Yeah, I like that. So what do you love most about being a Dom in your personal life?
What do I love most? That's an interesting question. I would say that for me, it's all about exploring different things constantly, because there is always another thing that you can learn. You can always up your skill set. So for me, it's definitely about that. I love Predicament Bondage.
Yeah.
So that's my personal preference.
Yeah. Can you just explain quickly what Predicament Bondage is? Because I don't think everyone listening is going to know. And I call this woman the Predicament Bondage Queen. So just give us a little hint about what that is.
So it obviously has to do with bondage, which is restraint. But you can incorporate different tools, for instance, weights and things like that. And it's about balance. And basically you put someone in a situation where if they lean too far that way, they're going to have a different physical experience, to put it nicely. So you might put someone, I'll give you an example. So you might put someone on their tippy toes.
Yeah.
And they're reaching, and their hands might be tied to what I like to call it's a butcher's hook, but to make it sound less aggressive, it actually goes up the butthole like a butt plug.
Like a fish hook.
Correct.
Think of a fish hook, people.
Correct. And so their hands would be tied to that, and they're on their tippy toes over a bar.
So their hands are tied up to the front of their bodies and then kind of held up in like you'd be praying to God.
Correct. And, your arms and toes might get tired, but once you relax, you're then going to have a different sensation from the other end.
Yeah. So you have a choice, your arms or your anus.
Correct. And that was one of my definite fun options. And when you have a very willing and submissive masochist who enjoys pain and very consensually enjoys pain, then it is something that you can explore with that's very physical.
Yeah. So do you think it's changed you becoming a Dom?
Absolutely. I'm very confident in who I am, and I own my own.
Yeah. Would you
everything.
say it's made you more you?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%. I feel that anybody's sexual journey is going to eventually find out a very true version of themselves. So whatever journey your life takes you on sexually, for me, this was a very big part of discovering who I was, especially growing up in a very restrictive cult.
Yeah.
A very man power, dominant, male-led
yeah.
cult, then definitely being female empowered and taking back ownership of your sexuality was very much a big discovery about who I was.
Yeah. Now, with a Dom sub personal relationship, what do you think are some of the, I'd say, like softer characteristics that, so we all know the tools of the trade that you've learned, you've, seen professional Doms, you practice things on yourself, you're looking up online. But what things do you think, like personality characteristics, do you think are really important to be a Dom?
You definitely need that soft side.
Yeah.
And as I discussed earlier, an empathic side of yourself. You need to have empathy for somebody, and you need to really introduce that into your play.
Yeah.
Because a lot of misconceptions about Dom women is that they hate men.
Yeah.
I actually love men.
Yeah.
And it's about enjoyment and misconceptions about it being about pain.
Yeah.
It is, far from that. It's actually about enjoyment and people's line between pleasure and pain is very small.
Yeah.
And knowing where to get that balance right.
And everyone's different. That's the other thing. Everyone's different. And I think people don't realize, it's a lot in the head. It's a very psychological thing, BDSM. It's not just about what's physically happening to you. It's a lot about what's the headspace at.
Yeah, for me, definitely when I'm putting together a session which could go for about 5 hours, it is about the mind space and making sure that when you're going for that long, I will have different things I'm going to be doing, but you need to make sure that you want them to get through that and reach the end point, which is obviously I like to take all my subs to Subspace.
Yeah.
And a Subspace is a very mental and physical combination where people actually say they become out of their mind and out of their thinking and totally into the body's reactions of the sensations that they're feeling.
Yeah. It's been, we talked about this in series 1 about, it's been likened to like that transcendental meditative state. They're just like a bit floaty. They're a bit, out of their bodies kind of feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a heightened experience.
Yeah.
And I would say a mindgasm.
Yeah.
So it's not just a physical sensation. It's something that you are definitely experiencing on all different levels.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it means it's almost more intense, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's an almost more intense. I love to call, play sessions, whether you're playing kink or non-kink, but like the type of play I think that you can have in BDSM or in kink, I think often it's a lot deeper. And the connection with the other person can go a lot deeper because of what you're doing.
You really need to understand when you're with a sub that you need to understand who that person is. And for me, in a relationship, being a relationship Dom, so not a professional, but someone who does this as their personal preference, you get to learn a lot about a person on a deeper level and a sexual level because you're very open and you talk about limits and communication,
Yep.
expectation, and you're willing to explore a lot of different angles with that person's body. So, yeah, you definitely get to know their body on a deeper level, but mentally also because you talk about what you like. A lot of people would find that concept weird when they're not even happy to explain to somebody how to get them to orgasms.
Yes.
So I think in BDSM you need to be very open and honest about all of your body preferences.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point you talk about. If we think about, non-kink relationships, I mean, I think a lot of people do struggle telling their partner simply, what turns them on or, what type of porn they like to watch sometimes. I think that's something that's very hard for people just to even communicate about sex and your preferences. And I think in BDSM, you're forced to. It's not going to work if you can't communicate. It's not going to work if you can't express to the other person you're playing with what's your boundaries, what's your limits, what you're into, would you say?
You absolutely need to be vocal about these things because it's a lot about trust and understanding. And so you need to be able to explain. And my previous subs, we've actually had the contract and we've actually had the conversations of do's and don'ts for the long term, and they all can be renegotiated prior to trying something new. So anytime you want to introduce something new, it definitely needs to be sat down and talked about before you do that.
Can you just quickly explain what a DS contract is? Because I don't think everyone's going to know what that is.
So a contract is basically negotiating upfront before any physical play, what your limits are, what the safe words would be, hard limits, soft limits. So a hard limit would be something that you're absolutely not okay with happening. A soft limit is something that you're consensually okay for the dominant to play with that area, push your limits a little bit in that area. So there's definitely a long conversation to be had, and a contract is something that you agree on up front so that you don't have to always renegotiate. You can play safely within all of those terms.
Yeah.
And then it's only once you're introducing something else that you would have to then renegotiate that contract. And that contract can be up to the individual as to how long you would want to sign that or whether you want to review that for like every 3 months.
Yeah. And I think it also, comes back down to one of the biggest thing I know we've talked about at length about, consent. At the heart of BDSM is consent. And I think, a contract is really helpful probably to clarify what someone is and isn't consenting to. But I think as you explained, it gets renegotiated all the time.
Yeah, it definitely does, because as you get to know each other better and as you start exploring this, and I encourage everybody who wants to, start very soft.
Soft and slow, slower than slow, softer than soft is my tagline.
Absolutely. But when you get to know each other better and you start exploring different things together, what might have been a hard no or a hard limit then all of a sudden becomes actually, I am interested in discussing that. So that is optional for both. And part of the contract is that both the sub and the dom can make changes to this contract before any play session. So, if they decide, well, last play session I didn't like this and this, they can then say, I want to renegotiate before we play again. Yeah. So it's definitely, I highly recommend a contract because especially in a relationship that's longer term, it sets very specific limits and very for the Dom, it's fun because you can play within that range without disclosing every single time what you're going to do.
Yeah.
You can play safely because you already have their consent to that. So you can surprise them as opposed to going, let's sit down and have a chat about what I'm going to do to you today. Longer term relationships, I definitely recommend having a full conversation and a contract.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I think just, highlighting the difference between, the personal Dom and, me coming at it from a professional angle. I literally have to sit at the start of every session and negotiate that contract because it needs to be, very clean cut, consensual. And, I think it's interesting you hearing that you've got a bit more bandwidth to kind of play with because, it's with the same partner. It's something that you've negotiated over a period of time and you kind of know where you can take it. But I think, when you're looking at it from a professional sense, I literally spell it out at the beginning of sessions, like this is what we're going to do, not down to the second by second minute, but at least, the general activities of what the session's going to include, because I think from a professional point of view, you really need to have that line between, consent. Otherwise, it's just, abuse if I haven't got it at the beginning. What are your thoughts on that line between, consent and abuse? Because it happens in every relationships, kinky and non-kinky ones. What do you think is like the defining line of that?
Consent.
Yeah.
is because what someone finds as pleasurable, another person can find as pain.
Yeah.
So it's definitely about discussing limits up front before introducing anything into play. And I feel like people that practice BDSM are often way better at discussing these things.
Definitely.
Because it is something that you proactively sit down and discuss before a scene.
Yep.
Whereas I do feel you're at more risk in other life choices, sexual life choices, because people tend to not be as open and not disclose what their preferences are before play.
And I think also, I know we've talked about this before, but assumptions. People make assumptions, I think, a lot of the time of what they think someone's into. And I was telling you a case a couple of weeks ago, a girlfriend of mine she was having a play, as this is a non-kink play, with someone she knew already in a sexual capacity. And she said, in the middle of our play session, he's like, spit in my mouth, pulling my hair. And this was nothing that they had ever spoken about before. It wasn't consented to pre-play. And I'm just like, that would never happen in a correct BDSM scene. No one would just randomly do stuff to you that you've never consented to before. And I think it's really interesting that people, think BDSM, they think like abuse of power, they think people doing things that they don't want to do, but in fact it's quite the opposite. I would actually argue that it's more in the non-kink world, you're going to end up in those situations where you actually haven't consented to things. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And there's always in BDSM safe words.
Yes.
Which you can openly say at any time. You can use, for instance, red, yellow, green, the light system, which most people use, which is widely recognised as a safe BDSM practice, which basically means when it's red, you stop. You drop.
We break scene.
You absolutely break scene and you take time out. And I don't think anyone has that in general life other than no. And the reason we don't use no in the BDSM world is because no can definitely
be part of the scene.
Be part of the scene. And
consensual non-consent scenes especially.
And I feel like they don't discuss that enough in the outside world. In the outside world, I say that because I feel like BDSM
the non-kink world.
The non-kink world. BDSM definitely has its own set of rules that I think would be definitely a benefit to people using that system, especially the red light system, in any kind of play.
Yeah. It's interesting. I know you say like the non-kink world has the word no, but I think it's interesting how little it's used. You know, I explained the example of my friend a few weeks ago. Did she say no during it? No. You know, it's almost looked, I don't know if it's down upon, but people struggle, I think, especially in the moment of play with someone to kind of say no. It could be, I'm worried about hurting their feelings. I'm worried they're thinking I'm not into this, but like they will just go along with it. Do you think that's different in BDSM?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I feel like subs don't want to let you down.
Yeah.
So they might push their limits.
Yeah.
But pushing limits is okay.
Yeah.
As long as it's pre-consented to. Because you have those rules and because you have already discussed limits, then you definitely make sure that your sub feels confident and comfortable using the red.
Yes.
And knowing that with confidence that you will stop whatever you are doing in that space at that time. So it's encouraged.
That's what I was going to say. You're rewarded for, I always say that to my clients, like you will never be punished for using red, or, I mean, I always tell them, tell me when you get to an orange. But you will be rewarded for using red.
Absolutely rewarded for using red, because it's your very last point of guidance, basically. But I have had a sub use a red with me before, and the only thing that happens in that situation is I get disappointed in myself because I've misread a situation. But you learn from that and you grow. So it's definitely a very safe environment to play in.
Yeah. I think another area I think you can get a bit disappointed with yourself, and I certainly notice this with my sessions, is if I can't get my client into their normal subspace. And that's something I've noticed that I take on to myself a lot. If I can't get them there, it's kind of like the end goal, but they're not always going to get there. And I think we accept that they're not always going to get there, but it's funny, I think, how the Dom takes that on.
Yeah, absolutely. I've experienced the biggest Dom drops from not having what I call a satisfying session, which is the whole point of play is for them to reach subspace in my mind. So not orgasm, but subspace.
Yes.
So for them, that is the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
So when you put together a session and you're leading your sub to that, then you don't reach it. You can actually be really hard on yourself, and it could just be their personal experience for that day. So they might not have been.
Bad day at work, bad day with family.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the absolute beauty of BDSM is after a session and when you're coming down from a session, one of my biggest things is to talk about play. So you talk about that.
Part of your aftercare.
Absolutely. Yeah. Part of my aftercare is talking about how, I noticed you didn't get into subspace. What's been happening? Yeah. Did you want to tell me why? Was something not right? And it could just be that their pain tolerance wasn't as big as it was previously, because we all have different days. So those conversations during aftercare are so important.
So what would you say would be the best positive impacts BDSM has on your personal relationships outside of the bedroom?
Open communication.
Yeah.
Being very, very comfortable in talking about everything that you're feeling and knowing that that's going to be accepted without any judgment.
Yeah.
So it's given me a lot of confidence to address issues that I would have previously shied away from due to fear of judgment and rejection.
Yeah. Are there any negative ones? Or have there ever been any negative ones?
Experiences.
Mm-hmm. As in negative impacts from having BDSM play or BDSM as part of your relationship, and it's negatively impacted your personal relationship outside of the bedroom?
Absolutely not.
No.
It's definitely a relationship I feel is very intense, and you get to know someone extremely well, extremely quickly during this exploration. So with that comes, if the relationship doesn't work, it can be harder to recover from, because you feel like you know that person so intently.
Yeah.
So it's not something whereas when you're dating in
Non-kink world.
non-kink world, when you're dating in non-kink world, you might take your time getting to know someone over a few months.
Yeah.
When you're going straight into a BDSM relationship, you're talking about things up front that you wouldn't discuss maybe even ever in a normal relationship. So before any sexual contact, you're talking about preferences and things like that. So you really go into it very honestly and openly and vulnerably.
Yeah. What in your, experience has been the hardest lesson to learn in BDSM, or having a BDSM relationship in your personal life?
One of the hardest things, I think, is that a lot of submissive males, because it's not, especially in Australia, not as accepted, they don't tend to be open about it. So family and friends,
They're still in the closet.
They are very much.
They're still in that very kinky BDSM closet.
They're very much in the closet, and it's a dangerous closet to be in, if you know what I have in my closet. So there definitely is that side of it where they very much don't want to be public and don't want to be open about your relationship, because they're worried of the judgment of others. So that's been really, really hard, because this is not something I do separately.
Yes.
This is my sexual preference.
Yeah.
And this is how I like to interact in relationships as well. So that's definitely been the hardest thing to learn, is that you could fall in love with a sub, but they're not okay, and they haven't vocally discussed this with anyone else. So they're not going to be able to be in a long-term relationship which encompasses everything else as well, because they're not willing to accept who they are.
Do you think that's a deal breaker now for you, if someone's not willing to be public about it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not that you have to scream it from the rooftops. And obviously I'm covered today.
Yeah.
Because I understand that it's not something that you need to discuss with everybody, but I really believe that you need to be comfortable in your sexuality, no matter what that is.
Yeah.
And I feel like BDSM is still so frowned upon in a lot of areas, because people don't understand it, which is why I think this kind of forum is so great, so that people can understand that this is actually just an exploration of sexuality and an extension of that.
Yeah. Now, I know we discussed a bit about the DS contract, and I've said, mine's a verbal one. I do it at the start of every session with my client. Occasionally, if they're, someone who's very much in the BDSM community or been practicing a long time, they may email me one that they already have, which is helpful. But, at the start of every session, even if it has been emailed to me, I will go through with them that contract. So you've mentioned it does make it a lot easier having a written contract when you're in a personal DS relationship. Now, even though you've got this contract, do things go wrong sometimes?
Absolutely. It's not a perfect system.
Yeah.
And your skill set definitely is a big factor in this. So you definitely need to know what you're doing, and you definitely need to practice. As I said, I practice on myself. I practice long time before I introduce something new into play. So that definitely has that risk factor when you're introducing something new and you're discussing it, and it might be the first time you do something and something could go wrong. Just to give an example, you might not have tied up a weight correctly and it falls to the ground. You want to make sure that when you're placing weights and things like that, that, you know, things like shoes and that might not be involved on your sub's foot. So a ball could drop, a weighted ball could drop and hit a toe or something like that. That's definitely a minor incident, but that could happen. And for me, I think it's extremely important if you are going to practice this long term in your life. It's something that you're wanting to introduce into your relationships, that you go and make sure, like I'm first aid trained, I have my first aid certificate. So I feel like as a Dom in the relationship, it's 100% responsible thing to do to make sure that you know about resuscitation, about how to control bleeding and different things like wrapping wounds and things like that, which you can learn in a day course through a very available service nowadays where you can do most of your training online and then you go and you do an 8-hour course to make sure that you know how to handle first aid. But yeah, every time you do this, you need to practice safely. Yeah. And you need to make sure that things, when you are getting into a little bit more dangerous, that you understand how to tie knots correctly, how to place ropes correctly so that they're not on pressure points that can cut off circulation. And if worst case scenario, something does happen, you need to be calm and be able to know that you can manage that situation as well.
Yep. I always have a first aid kit and rope cutting scissors nearby.
Absolutely.
Now, do you get pleasure from inflicting pain?
I do have a sadist side of me, so
do I.
I definitely get enjoyment. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a sexual enjoyment, but I get enjoyment from doing that. The sexual enjoyment from my side of it is really to do with taking the sub on the journey that I have put together, which might have taken me a week to put together a session, and to do different activities and things like that to take them to subspace. So my sexual pleasure doesn't necessarily need a masochist.
Yeah.
My current sub is a rope bunny. Mm-hmm. So what that means is someone who enjoys being tied and restrained. So that has absolutely nothing to do with pain. Mm-hmm. So for me, I can definitely enjoy different aspects of taking different subs on different journeys. So they don't necessarily have to be masochists. I definitely love different aspects as well. So just tying someone and restraining someone so that they can't move, it's actually quite a comfortable position that they're in, and they feel really secure and comfortable in that, and that is their pleasure. So for me, it's enjoying taking my sub into subspace, and whatever leads to that is what I enjoy. Yeah. And I really, really enjoy putting together a play session based around what is going to get them into subspace.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's, you mentioned a really good point. BDSM, people automatically think pain. There's so much of BDSM that does not involve any pain. And as you said, subspace, it's a headspace. Getting into a headspace doesn't necessarily need to be led by pain. So I think that's a really good point you make. You've mentioned, your current partner, obviously he's more of a rope bunny. You do have a bit of a sadist streak in you. When you have your kinks, obviously, and your things that you've explored and your preferences, and then you meet someone new and they bring their own kinks to the table, how do you meet in the middle?
I think I'm lucky in that I do this long term in relationships as well. So what you might start out with definitely can lead to different aspects, and because you're so open and discussing preferences and things you like and don't like, you can introduce new things all the time. So when you meet someone, you can definitely talk about what their preferences are today, what your preferences are today, but that's not a breaking point, because as the relationships grow, you can definitely be open to different things and introducing different things into your relationship.
So maybe trying each other's kinks out a bit more.
100%, if they're open and willing, which most people are, because they are willing to try and push limits and things like that. So definitely it's something that isn't, okay, well, you don't meet exactly what I like to do today and right now, but because it's a long-term relationship, it's something that can grow and develop along the way. But I definitely enjoy different aspects, and for me it's not one thing or the other. So it's not for me where I would stop the relationship even if they never wanted to try it, because I would still be able to enjoy that relationship through the means that we both find pleasurable.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Do you think there are situations where two people who are both, in the BDSM kink world, someone comes with a very strong kink, and I'm going to deliberately use the next word, fetish, because we've discussed in previous episodes the difference between a kink and a fetish. A kink being something that you like doing but is not necessary for sexual gratification, while a fetish is necessary. So do you think that someone could come with a kink or a fetish to a relationship, and if the other partner is just completely not into that at all, do you think there are situations it's not going to work?
Fetish, when someone classifies it as a fetish, to your point, that's what they actually need to feel sexually satisfied.
Yeah.
When it becomes a fetish, and a kink can grow into a fetish.
Yeah.
When it is somebody's fetish, so a foot fetish, for instance, when that is someone's fetish and I aren't open to exploring that, then I would not be able to take on that relationship and that sub, because I would know that ultimately they need that particular thing.
Yeah.
If it's a kink, then kinks are fine, because a lot of the time a kink you can do without certain things.
Yeah.
So there's no real no-go zone. But if it is a fetish, and kinks can grow into a fetish by starting out, I want to try this, to then becoming, I need this. And when it's an I need this, then definitely the relationship wouldn't work unless both people are okay exploring that.
Yeah. And I think that's where you can come back to negotiation. Things, as you said, things do change in the DS dynamic relationship, and you're always negotiating. So I think if it, something like that does happen, that's when you come back to the negotiation table and like, how do we deal with this? And because you've got the tools on how to communicate, you may come up with a resolution. You may not, that resolution, maybe we no longer continue this DS contract. Maybe that person goes and finds it from someone else. But it's, you can always come back to that.
Definitely, and it definitely needs to be talked about. As soon as someone, I would say, realizes something has become a fetish, then it needs to be openly discussed and renegotiated to make sure that both people are comfortable with that. Because when something becomes a fetish, it might have to be introduced in every play session. So absolutely, if it's a fetish that either the Dom or the sub has, that person needs to discuss that with the other and renegotiate that be involved in every play session.
I just want to bring it back to you and your partner. Do you think that you walking down the street or you going into a restaurant, that people would automatically look at you and be like, they're in a DS dynamic?
Absolutely not. However, if you know me, you know. But absolutely not. However, saying that, that's not a hard limit for me. So I would definitely be open to being that public. But I'm currently not. And I understand that would only be appropriate in different circumstances anyway, but I like to do it secretly. So it might be a butt plug that my sub is wearing while we're out to dinner. and I have control of that via my phone.
Yeah.
I don't even need to be in the same country with my sub these days. It's an app that you can buy. So it's definitely there's a lot of aspects where you can be public privately, if that makes sense.
But it's not tattooed on your forehead as you walk into every restaurant.
No, it's not. But I think there would be circumstances where I would be happy introducing that kind of play
into the public world. So I just want to wrap up this episode and ask you one final question, which I think would be really nice for our listeners. If you could give couples who are starting out on a DS relationship and journey, what advice would you give?
Open and honest communication. I would recommend that if you are in a relationship, that you look at putting pen to paper or putting it in on a computer what your limits are. So maybe go away, write down what you individually want to explore, and then come back and you can make a contract out of that, and definitely understand what each other's limits are. Yes, I would do that. No, I would not do that. I'm willing to try that. Don't know if I'm going to like it or not. And create a contract together, which can always be renegotiated. But 100%, if you're in a relationship, do that, because you've got something that you can go back to constantly. And it's actually really exciting to sit down and think about what your limits are and what you would like to try and what you wouldn't like to try, and then swapping that with your partner and seeing what they want to try. You might learn a lot about each other, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. Well, thank you, Alex, for being here and being my first guest. This is going to be the first of a few episodes we're going to do with Alex, so I'm very excited to see where we next go with this. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to this episode, and as always, stay kinky.